Burned at Broken Bow, the Cheyenne girl who returned fire with fire, Nebraska Territory, 1876. The Nebraska Territory in 1876 was a land of wide, golden plains and rocky ridges that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was dry, the sky wide and endless, and the ground cracked under the hot sun. This was a place where the sounds of horses' hooves, the cries of native birds, and the whisper of wind were the music of daily life. Yet beneath this vast, peaceful beauty, trouble brewed. The land was at the center of a war no one had asked for, a war that would change everything. Etched had grown up on the edges of these plains, surrounded by her people, the Cheyenne. She was a young girl, barely 16, yet she had seen more than most of her age could imagine. Her people, proud and strong, had lived in harmony with the land for generations. They hunted, fished, and roamed freely across the vast expanse. But as the years passed, things changed. The settlers had come, men and women from faraway lands bringing their farms, their towns, and their ways of life. These settlers were like a rising tide, slowly pushing the Cheyenne from the places they called home. The Cheyenne knew they could not stay hidden forever. The land that had once been theirs, where their ancestors had walked, had begun to feel smaller and smaller, and now, in 1876, the soldiers were on the move too. The army had arrived, ready to impose their will on the people of the land. But the Cheyenne weren't afraid. They were proud. They were warriors. Etched's father had often spoken about the strength of the Cheyenne, how their ancestors had fought fiercely to protect their homes. She remembered his voice as he told her stories of their people's victories, of their great leaders who had never bowed to anyone. These stories filled her with pride, and yet, in her heart, she knew that the world around them was changing. Her father's warnings about the settlers, the soldiers, and the coming storm had grown more serious in the last year. He had warned her that this might be the last year the Cheyenne would be free. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red and orange, Etched sat on a hill near her camp watching the horizon. Her family's camp was nestled by the creek, surrounded by tall grass that swayed in the breeze. She could hear the sound of the fire crackling and her mother's voice calling out, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her younger brother was playing with some of the other children, his laughter a sound of innocence, but Etched's mind was heavy with worry. She didn't know what the future would hold, but deep inside she felt that something terrible was coming. The peace of the evening was shattered by a distant sound, a thunderous pounding of hooves. At first, Etched thought it might be the horses from their tribe returning from a hunt, but as the sound grew closer, a feeling of unease washed over her. The pounding of hooves was not a familiar sound. It was the sound of something coming that did not belong. She stood up, dusting the dirt off her knees, and hurried down to her family's camp. The worry on her face must have shown because her mother immediately walked over to her. "Stay close, Etched," her mother said softly, her voice filled with both love and concern. "Something isn't right." Etched nodded, but her eyes kept darting toward the horizon. The sound of the horses grew louder, and she could now hear the shouts of men and the clanging of metal. A chill ran through her, and she felt as though the ground beneath her was slipping away. Within moments, the first of the settlers appeared. They rode in on horses, their faces hardened and cold. The soldiers followed, their uniforms looking out of place against the natural beauty of the land. They were here. The army had come, and with them, so had the settlers, men who did not belong here, men who had no respect for the land or its people. Etched's heart raced as the strangers moved closer. She could feel the fear rising in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She had been taught to stand tall, to never let her emotions betray her. Her father had always said that the Cheyenne were stronger than any force that came against them. But that strength was being tested now. The settlers were making their way toward the camp, their faces grim, their eyes cold. Etched could see that they meant trouble. They had come for something, and they would take it whether the Cheyenne liked it or not. The air was thick with tension. As the first settlers reached the camp, their leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, dismounted from his horse. He looked around at the Cheyenne with a sneer on his face. "Move along, Indian," he said harshly, addressing the eldest warrior in the group. His voice was loud, demanding. "This land now belongs to us. The army has given it to us. You don't belong here anymore." Etched's father, who had been standing tall by the fire, stepped forward. His gaze was steady, though his fists clenched at his sides. "This land is ours," he said quietly, his voice filled with the strength of many generations. "It has always been ours." The settler leader laughed, his eyes narrowing. "You are foolish," he said, his voice full of contempt. "You should leave before it's too late." The settlers began to spread out, looking through the camp as though it were already theirs to claim. Etched watched, feeling her chest tighten. They were not just taking the land, they were taking the very spirit of her people. The Cheyenne were known for their pride, their strength, their bond with the land, and now it was all at risk. Suddenly, a shout rang out. One of the settlers had grabbed her younger brother, pulling him roughly away from the other children. Atsadi's heart skipped a beat as she watched the settler twist her brother's arm, dragging him toward his horse. "Let him go!" Atsadi shouted, her voice cracking with urgency. Her father moved quickly, but the settler swung around, drawing his weapon. It was too late. The violence had started. In the chaos that followed, Atsadi's world exploded. There were shouts, gunfire, and the sound of running feet. Her mother grabbed her, pulling her away from the violence, but Atsadi's eyes were locked on her brother, who was now on the ground, his face bruised and covered in dirt. In that moment, something inside Atsadi snapped. She could feel the rage building in her chest like a wildfire, consuming her every thought. She didn't care about the settlers or their guns or the soldiers who now rode in, surrounding the camp. Her brother had been hurt, and she would not stand by. With a cry, Atsadi broke free from her mother's grip and ran toward the fight. Her heart pounded in her chest, her feet pounding the earth beneath her. She was no longer just a girl. She was a Cheyenne warrior, determined to protect her people and her family, no matter the cost. The chaos of the attack seemed to slow down as Atsadi's heart pounded in her chest. The world around her was a blur of dust, shouting, and the crackle of gunfire. She could hear the steady thumping of hooves as more settlers and soldiers rode in from all sides, surrounding the camp. Her mind raced. She had to do something. Her brother was on the ground, injured. Her family was in danger. Atsadi's mother's voice rang out, sharp and urgent. "Get back! Get away from here." She pulled Atsadi's arm, trying to drag her away from the center of the violence. But Atsadi couldn't let go. She couldn't just stand by. She saw her father, standing tall, despite the madness, moving toward the settler who had hurt her brother. He wasn't one to back down, not when it came to protecting his family. His presence, calm and firm, seemed to demand respect from everyone around him, but respect was the last thing these settlers had for him. "Please, let him go." Atsadi's voice cracked as she shouted. She could feel the tears in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't a child anymore. She was strong. Her people had been strong for centuries, and right now she was ready to prove that strength. The settler holding her brother sneered at her, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You should learn your place, little girl," he said, tightening his grip on her brother's arm. Atsadi's body tensed as she felt the fire of anger ignite within her. This wasn't just about protecting her brother. This was about her people, her land, her family. Everything that had been taken, everything that was at risk, it was all suddenly clear to her. She had to fight for it. She couldn't sit back any longer. She dashed forward, breaking free from her mother's hold. Her father was a warrior, and now, so was she. The world seemed to shift as she pushed through the chaos, moving like a whirlwind. Her thoughts were clear, her body moving with the strength of her ancestors. The settlers may have had their weapons, but she had something just as powerful, the will to defend her people. A loud gunshot rang out, followed by the sound of horses neighing. Atsadi's heart skipped a beat. She was running straight into the heart of the violence, but there was no turning back. She had to do something, or they would all be lost. Her brother, despite the pain, was still on the ground, his face twisted in fear. Atsadi knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she pulled him toward her, away from the settler's grip. She whispered comforting words to him, though her mind was focused on the danger around them. Suddenly the air was pierced by another shot, closer this time, and Atsadi's father stumbled. She gasped, her heart lurching as she watched him fall to his knees. The settlers had no mercy. They had come to take, and nothing would stop them. Without thinking, Atsadi leapt to her feet. She grabbed a nearby bow, one her father had once used in battle, and notched an arrow with hands that were both steady and trembling. She had seen her father use the bow countless times, but today it was her turn. The power of the weapon in her hands felt like a weight she was meant to carry. She aimed it at the settler who had been holding her brother. His attention was on her father, and for a moment he didn't see her. She released the arrow. It flew straight, its path true. The settler's hand went to his chest as the arrow struck, and he stumbled back, falling to the ground. He had never seen her coming. Atsadi's heart raced in her chest as the sound of the battle raged on. The settlers and soldiers were all around her, but she couldn't stop now. She couldn't let them win. She had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. The chaos seemed to intensify, but Atsadi's focus remained sharp. She reached for another arrow, her hands moving quickly, almost instinctively. The fear that had gripped her moments before was now gone, replaced by something fiercer: determination. She was no longer just a young girl. She was a protector, a warrior, and she would fight for her family, for her people, until her last breath. As she pulled back another arrow, a shout rang out, her father's voice, hoarse but full of command. "Atsadi, get to the horses!" Now. Atsadi's eyes darted toward him. He was still kneeling, his hand pressed to his side, but his eyes were clear, determined. He was hurt, but he was still strong. She could see the fire in his gaze, the same fire that had driven him for so long. She knew what he wanted. He wanted her to escape, to save herself, but she couldn't, not now. She shot another arrow, this time at a soldier who was moving toward her father. The arrow hit its mark and the soldier fell, taken by surprise. Atsadi's pulse quickened, but her focus never wavered. She wasn't going to let them take anything else. But then the soldiers began to surround her. She was outnumbered. They had more guns, more horses, but there was something in Atsadi's heart that told her not to back down. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about her people's future. A voice broke through the noise, one of the soldiers shouting orders. "Take them all. Don't leave anyone behind." The realization hit her hard. They weren't just here to fight. They had come to destroy. Her heart sank as she saw more soldiers riding in, closing in from all sides. But even then, Atsadi didn't stop. She grabbed another arrow, ready to fire again. Her people had always fought for their freedom, and she would do the same. Her father, despite his injury, called to her once more, his voice desperate. "Go! You have to Go now." But Atsadi shook her head, her heart refusing to listen. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. She ran toward the horses, toward safety, but only for a moment. She would not leave her family behind. She couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. As she reached for her father's arm, pulling him toward the horses, another wave of soldiers rode toward them. The air crackled with the sound of hooves and shouting, and Atsadi's heart raced in her chest. She knew that if they didn't move now, they would all be lost. But even as the danger closed in, Atsadi's resolve never faltered. She would fight for her people, for her family, and for the land that had always been theirs. And she would not let anyone take it from her, no matter what the cost. The sound of hooves pounding the earth filled the air, a deep thundering that echoed in Atsadi's chest. It was the sound of the settlers and soldiers closing in, their presence now unmistakable. Atsadi's heart beat faster, not with fear, but with the fire of determination. She had come too far to turn back now. Her people, her family, everything she held dear was in danger, and she was going to do whatever it took to protect them. She and her father were making their way toward the horses, each step they took feeling heavier with the growing tension. But just as they reached the horses, another soldier appeared in front of them, blocking their way. His eyes locked on Atsadi, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't sure what to make of her. He must have expected her to back down, to run in fear like others had, but she stood tall. You should have stayed out of this," the soldier said, his voice flat, but his eyes betrayed him. He was nervous. He could sense the fierceness in Atsadi, something wild and untamable that the soldiers were not prepared for. Atsadi didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she grabbed a rock from the ground, hurling it with all her might toward him. It struck his shoulder, making them stumble back. The force of the rock startled him, but she didn't stop there. She turned to her father, helping him onto his horse, keeping one eye on the soldiers. "Go," she said through clenched teeth. "I'll hold them off." Her father, though weakened by his injuries, shook his head. "Atsadi, no. You're not staying behind." But Atsadi wasn't listening. She was already pulling herself onto her own horse, the same one her father had ridden during the great hunts. It felt strong beneath her, its muscles tense with the weight of the moment. Her father's pleading voice was drowned out by the sounds of the approaching soldiers. They were getting closer. There was no time to argue. Atsadi spurred her horse forward, and with her father close behind her, she rode toward the edge of the camp. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the soldiers and settlers moving in, trying to catch up. Her heart raced, but she remained focused. They couldn't catch her. They couldn't catch her family. The landscape around them was familiar, yet the danger lurking just behind them made it feel like a strange, alien world. The wide-open plains seemed both endless and confining, offering no place to hide. Atsadi urged her horse to move faster, urging her father to keep up. She could hear the soldiers shouting now, their voices loud and demanding. They had formed a line across the land, trying to corner them. Atsadi's mind raced as she looked for a way out, a way to escape this trap, but there was no clear path. The soldiers were everywhere. Just then, Atsadi saw it, a narrow winding path cutting through the hills in the distance. It was a hidden route, one she had often ridden as a child, and she knew it well. If they could get to it, they might have a chance to lose the soldiers, but it would be risky. The soldiers would surely follow, and there was no guarantee the path would lead them anywhere safe. She turned to her father. "We can make it through the hills. Trust me." Her father's eyes were filled with worry, but he nodded. He trusted her. They had no choice. Together they guided their horses toward the hills, hoping the soldiers would be too slow to catch up. The terrain was rough, the ground uneven and rocky, but Atsadi pushed forward, her focus never wavering. She could feel the wind in her face, the thundering hooves beneath her, and the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had made a promise to herself that she wouldn't let her people fall. As they rode deeper into the hills, the landscape around them became more treacherous. The path was narrow, with sharp rocks on one side and steep drops on the other. Atsadi could hear the soldiers behind them, their hooves crashing against the earth as they struggled to keep up. The sound of pursuit only fueled her determination. She wasn't going to let them catch her now, not after everything. Her father struggled to keep up, his injuries slowing him down, but Atsadi stayed close by his side, making sure he didn't fall behind. The path twisted and turned, leading them through a narrow pass where the rocks seemed to close in around them. It was the perfect place to lose their pursuers, but only if they could make it through. Atsadi's horse seemed to sense the danger, its hooves tapping nervously against the rocky ground. Atsadi urged it forward, pushing herself harder. She could hear the soldiers getting closer now, their shouts more urgent. But they were still too far behind to catch up. Suddenly, Atsadi's horse stumbled, sending her crashing to the ground. Her heart leapt in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, quickly looking around. Her father's horse had stopped too, and he was looking at her with concern. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her voice tight. "We have to keep going." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed the reins of her horse, pulling it back onto its feet. Her father did the same, and together they continued down the winding path. The soldiers were still behind them, but the narrow pass was working in their favor. The soldiers couldn't ride through it as quickly as they could on the open plains. The path led them to a small creek, its waters rushing fast and wild over the rocks. Atsadi's horse hesitated, but she urged it forward, crossing the creek with her father close behind. The water splashed against the rocks, cold and sharp, but it didn't slow them down. They were almost through. As they reached the other side, Atsadi looked back for a moment. The soldiers had reached the creek, but they were struggling to cross. The rocky terrain made it difficult for them to keep up the chase. Atsadi's heart beat in her chest, the adrenaline surging through her as they rode away from the danger. But even as they escaped, she knew it wasn't over. The soldiers might not be able to catch them now, but they would keep coming. They wouldn't stop until they had their way. Atsadi and her father had only bought themselves a little time, but that time was enough to make their way deeper into the hills, where the land would offer them more protection. Her mind raced with thoughts of her people. They were scattered, hiding in the hills, but what would happen when the soldiers came for them? Would they be able to defend themselves? The Cheyenne had always been fighters, but how much longer could they hold on? Atsadi's thoughts were interrupted as she turned back to her father. His face was pale and his body swayed unsteadily on his horse. His injuries were worse than she had realized. He was strong, but he couldn't go on much longer. They needed to find shelter. They needed to rest. With a sense of urgency, Atsadi guided them to a small cave hidden in the hills. It was narrow, but it offered shelter from the soldiers who would no doubt be searching the area. As they entered the cave, Atsadi helped her father down from his horse. He leaned heavily against the rocks, his breath shallow and labored. "Rest," Atsadi said softly, her voice filled with both determination and concern. "We'll move again when it's safe." She knew it wasn't over. The soldiers were still out there. But for now, they had a chance to regroup, to plan their next move. They had made it this far, and Atsadi wasn't going to stop fighting until she had done everything in her power to protect her people. She would keep pushing forward no matter the cost. The hours seemed to stretch on as Atsadi sat in the dim light of the cave, her father resting beside her. The small, quiet space offered them some safety, but Atsadi's mind was racing. Every sound from outside made her jump. Every rustle of wind felt like the footstep of the soldiers coming to find them. She knew that staying in one place for too long was dangerous, but her father was injured, he needed rest, and so did she. The day had been long and exhausting. The chase, the fear, and the constant threat of capture weighed heavily on Atsadi's shoulders. She kept glancing toward the entrance of the cave, listening for any sound that might signal the soldiers' approach. But the night had grown quiet, the rush of the creek outside and the sound of crickets now the only things filling the air. Her father was asleep, though. His breathing was shallow and labored. Etched knew he was struggling. The wound he had received in the battle earlier that day was more serious than he had let on. His chest had been bleeding, but he hadn't said much about it. Like all warriors, he would rather endure the pain than show weakness. But Etched could see it. He was growing weaker by the minute. She had to do something to help him, but there was little they could do here. There was no medicine, no supplies, nothing to tend to the wound other than basic care. She pulled a blanket from her bag and laid it over him, her hands trembling as she adjusted it carefully. Her mind kept returning to the same thought. How long would they be safe here? How long before the soldiers found their way to this cave? To them. Outside, the stars were bright in the sky, their light casting faint shadows inside the cave. Etched stepped outside for a moment, letting the cool night air wash over her. She looked up at the sky, her thoughts drifting to her tribe. They were scattered across the land, hiding in the hills and the forests, doing their best to avoid the soldiers who had come to take everything from them. Etched's heart ached for them. For her people. For the land they had lived on for generations, now at risk of being torn apart by those who didn't understand its value, its spirit. She heard a rustling sound from inside the cave. Her father was stirring, his groans quiet but filled with pain. Etched hurried back inside, kneeling beside him. His eyes were open now, his face pale in the dim light. "I'm fine," he said softly, trying to sit up, but Etched placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, urging him to stay still. "No, you're not fine," she said, her voice filled with concern. "You're hurt. You need to rest." Her father gave her a weak smile. "I'm a warrior, Etched. I've fought battles that were harder than this." "I know," Etched said, "but this isn't a battle. It's survival. You need to rest." Her father looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "You've become strong, Etched. Stronger than I ever imagined." Etched smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. Her heart was heavy with the weight of what had happened and what was yet to come. She had taken up arms to protect her people, to defend her family, but the road ahead was uncertain. How much longer could they keep running? How long could they stay ahead of the soldiers who were determined to take everything from them? The night passed slowly, the quiet stretching on for what felt like hours. Etched couldn't sleep. She sat by her father, keeping watch, her thoughts never far from the soldiers. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind seemed like a warning. She had to be ready. They both had to be ready. In the morning, when the sun finally began to rise, casting a pale light over the hills, Etched knew they had to move again. Her father was still weak, but he was determined to continue. They couldn't stay in the cave forever. The soldiers would be searching for them, and the longer they remained in one place, the more likely it was they would be found. "I'll get the horses," Etched said, rising to her feet. "We need to keep moving." Her father nodded, though he didn't speak. His strength was fading, but he wasn't one to show weakness. Etched knew he would follow her lead, no matter how difficult it was. She had learned so much from him: how to fight, how to survive, and how to never give up. But even he couldn't fight against the wounds that had weakened him. He needed rest, but there was no time for that. Not yet. Etched walked to the edge of the cave, peering out into the open plains. The land stretched out before her, vast and unending. The hills where they had ridden the night before were still visible, but she knew they couldn't go back the way they had come. The soldiers would be looking for them, and they would know the paths the Cheyenne had used for generations. They would know where to find them. She had to think. She had to find another way. There was a small grove of trees a few miles to the east. It wasn't far, but it was well hidden. If they could make it there, they might have a better chance of avoiding the soldiers, but it would mean crossing open land. They would be exposed, and Etched couldn't be sure they wouldn't be spotted. But it was their best option. "Father," she said, turning back to him, "we have to move." He nodded slowly, his face drawn with exhaustion, but there was no hesitation in his eyes. "Lead the way." Etched helped him onto his horse, making sure he was steady before they set out. The horses moved slowly at first, their hooves tapping against the rocky ground. Etched kept her eyes on the horizon, watching for any signs of movement. The land seemed peaceful enough, but she knew better than to trust the quiet. The journey was slow. Every step felt like it took longer than the last. Etched could see the strain in her father's face, and she knew he was pushing himself. She couldn't help but worry for him. He was a warrior, but he wasn't invincible. He was only human, and this wound was more than just a scratch. It was deeper than he let on. They made their way eastward, the horses moving cautiously through the tall grass. The trees were getting closer, and Etched could almost taste the safety of the grove. But as they neared it, a sound in the distance caught her attention. The unmistakable sound of hooves. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Her eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. There, just barely visible against the morning light, were several riders, soldiers. They were coming toward them, fast. Panic surged through her, but she quickly pushed it down. They couldn't be seen. They couldn't be caught. "Father," she whispered urgently, "we need to move now." He nodded and urged his horse forward, his determination outweighing the pain. Etched followed closely behind, her heart pounding as the sound of the soldiers grew louder. They had no choice. If they didn't reach the grove, they would be caught. And if they were caught, Etched pushed the thought away. They would make it. They had to. The grove was in sight now, the trees offering the promise of safety. But they were still too far away, and the soldiers were closing in fast. Etched pushed her horse harder, urging it faster. She glanced over her shoulder. The soldiers were still coming, but they were slow. The rough terrain was slowing them down. "We can make it," she muttered under her breath. "We can make it." Disappear. She could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her. This was it. This was the chance. They would either escape or be caught, and with one final push, they reached the trees. The soldiers were still a distance away, but they had to stay hidden. Etched and her father ducked into the cover of the trees, hoping to remain unseen. For now they were safe, but the journey was far from over. The soldiers would keep coming, and Etched would keep fighting. The sun had climbed high in the sky by the time Etched and her father rested beneath the cover of the trees. The grove, with its thick canopy of leaves and the gentle whisper of the wind, provided some shelter from the heat, but the tension in the air was far from gone. Despite their brief respite, Etched couldn't relax. Her thoughts were consumed by the soldiers who were still out there searching for them. It had only been a matter of time before they would move on, and Etched knew that every minute they stayed in one place brought them closer to danger. Her father, despite his wounds, was resting against the trunk of a nearby tree. His face was pale, and his eyes were closed, but the exhaustion was still visible in the way he sat. Etched could see the strain in his every movement, how he held himself together even though his body was clearly betraying him. She wanted to help, to ease his pain, but there was nothing more she could do for now. Their only choice was to keep moving. Etched's mind raced as she watched the branches sway above them. She knew they couldn't stay in the grove for long. The soldiers would likely continue searching the area, and the Cheyenne were a known target. They had already attacked settlers, and the army was determined to find them. The thought of being caught, of losing her family, made her heart ache, but she couldn't let herself be consumed by fear. She had seen too much of that in the past days. Fear of what might happen next, fear of what they might lose, but she refused to let it control her now. Her father stirred beside her, a faint groan escaping his lips as he tried to sit up. Etched quickly moved to his side, helping him as he struggled to steady himself. He looked at her with tired eyes, but there was still a fire within him, something deep inside that refused to give up. "I'm not sure how much further I can go, Etched," he said quietly, his voice rough with fatigue. "We've come so far already. You don't have to keep carrying this burden alone." Etched felt her chest tighten at the sound of his words. She had known that her father's strength was wearing thin, but hearing it aloud made the reality even more real. But there was no time to dwell on it. She had to keep going, for both of them. "You've been the strength of our people for as long as I've known," Etched replied softly, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "And now it's my turn to be strong for you." Her father's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. "You've always been strong, my daughter," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll see this through, even if I can't." Etched helped him to his feet, guiding him carefully as they made their way toward the narrow path that led further into the hills. The trees thinned out as they continued, the rocky terrain growing more uneven beneath their feet. Etched led the way, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. She knew that even the smallest sound could draw attention, and she wasn't about to take any chances. As they walked, Etched's thoughts turned to the rest of her people. She had heard whispers of where some of them were hiding. Families in caves, warriors in the forests, all scattered in different directions to avoid being found by the soldiers. The Cheyenne were used to living off the land, to surviving in difficult conditions, but the constant fear of discovery made every moment feel like a test. They could never relax, never let their guard down. Etched felt a pang of guilt at the thought of the others. She had been so focused on keeping her father safe that she hadn't given much thought to the rest of the tribe. But they couldn't be everywhere at once. They could only do what they could. For now, the goal was survival. Everything else would have to wait. The path they were on wound its way up the hill, leading them to a higher ridge where they could get a better view of the land below. Atsadi hoped that by reaching the top, they could scout the area, make sure the soldiers hadn't followed them. As they neared the ridge, she saw the distant movement of figures on horseback. Soldiers. They were riding in the opposite direction, but the sight of them sent a chill down Atsadi's spine. The soldiers were still out there, still looking for them. "Stay low," Atsadi whispered, pulling her father closer to the rocks at the top of the ridge. They crouched down, hidden by the tall grass and the boulders around them. Atsadi watched the soldiers, her heart pounding as they moved along the valley below. There were at least 5 of them, but they didn't seem to be searching for anything in particular. They were just riding, scanning the landscape as if they were looking for something. Someone. Atsadi's breath caught in her throat as one of the soldiers stopped, his gaze scanning the area. Her body tensed, every muscle on high alert. Could they see them? Could they hear the beating of their hearts? She held her breath, praying that they wouldn't notice her and her father. The soldier turned his horse, and Atsadi exhaled in relief. They were safe, for now, but that was all it was, a temporary safety. The soldiers would keep searching, and the threat would always be there, lurking just beyond the horizon. Once the soldiers had passed, Atsadi and her father made their way down the ridge, keeping to the shadows and moving quickly. They needed to put distance between themselves and the soldiers, to find a place where they could rest without being found. They could not afford to be caught again. As they continued on, the land began to change. The hills gave way to a dense forest, the trees taller and thicker, providing more cover from the outside world. Atsadi knew this area well. It was a place where she and her people had once hunted, a place where they had gathered before the soldiers had come. It was quiet here, peaceful, and for a moment Atsadi allowed herself to feel a small sense of calm. But that feeling was fleeting. The reality of their situation was never far from her mind. They had to keep moving, keep surviving. No matter how much they wanted peace, they could not afford to rest. The soldiers were always just a step behind. As they reached the heart of the forest, Atsadi found a small clearing. It was sheltered, hidden by trees on all sides, and it seemed like the perfect place to stop. Her father was exhausted, and she knew that he needed rest, even if they couldn't afford to stop for long. They could stay here for a while, gather their strength before moving on again. Atsadi helped him down from his horse, guiding him to a spot near the trees where they could rest. She didn't have much, just a small bag of supplies, but she made the best of it, offering him what little they had to eat and drink. For a brief moment, it felt like everything was calm. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the soft chirping of birds, it was a stark contrast to the tension they had been living with. But even in this moment of quiet, Atsadi knew that it wouldn't last. They had to stay vigilant. They had to be ready. As she sat beside her father, watching over him, she thought about everything they had been through, about the journey, about the battles they had fought, and the ones still to come. She thought about her people, scattered across the land, fighting to survive. They had always been strong, but now they were being tested in ways they never imagined. And as Atsadi sat there, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, she made a promise to herself. No matter what came next, she would not give up. She would protect her family, her people, and her land, and she would fight until there was nothing left to fight for.